Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about McKinney-Vento and exploring doubled up situations. My name is Donna Cash. I'm the state coordinator for McKinney-Vento Homeless Program, and I will be hosting this webinar today. This is my contact information. If you have questions after the webinar, please feel free to reach out and either call me or send me an email if you have any additional questions. So let's take a look at what causes homelessness. The McKinney-Vento Act defines homeless children and youth as those individuals or students who lack a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. And the term includes children and youth who are sharing the housing of other persons due to a loss of housing for economic hardships or similar reasons. It includes children who are sharing the housing of others due to a loss of housing. Sometimes those doubled up situations is what we refer to. Living in hotel motels or trailer parks. Those are meant for like RV campers that you use for vacations. Camping grounds. All of these situations due to a lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Living in emergency or transitional shelters, or children who have been abandoned in hospitals. Children and youth, your students who have a primary nighttime residence that is not a public or private place and it's not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings. Students and youth who are living in cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. So if you look at this slide, it kind of gives you a history of why homelessness is so pervasive across the United States. Two trends that we're seeing, of course, is that affordable housing and an increase in severe poverty. Keep in mind that migratory children who qualify as homeless because they're living in similar circumstances are also covered by the McKinney-Vento Act. This just represents our doubled up population. In the 2013 school year, we've got a little bit of overlay on the graphics, and I apologize for that. There were over 1,240,000 students across the nation that were identified in the United States as homeless. And out of that number, 75% were living in a doubled up situation. And we see that across each state, across the nation. Our doubled up population is our biggest population identified under McKinney-Vento. So the number of families that were living in doubled up residency has steadily increased since 2006. And 75% of those are reporting that they've lost their homes to foreclosure and have then sought refuge in the residencies of families or friends. Research has found that homeless youth are a very mobile group, and they often move numerous times throughout the school year, and they experience education differently than their house peers. That means that the individuals of the subpopulation of students and the intensive shame that's created by these barriers to access affects our children. So being retained in elementary school is connected to lower high school graduation rates, and we see that oftentimes in our homeless population. And keep in mind that by the 6th grade, students who have changed schools 4 times or more lose approximately 1 year of educational growth. As he explored homelessness and especially the doubled up population for our students, HALLETT, the author tells us that he explored the effects of living doubled up and what it had on their educational experiences of adolescence that he studied. Those individuals who live doubled up often don't feel like they're at home in their current living situation. For an example, they can't go to the refrigerator and get something out in the middle of the day, perhaps. They feel like they're invading someone else's refrigerator. They can't get up and go to the restroom in the middle of the night if they need to. And then while living doubled up, families often use the term, it's the last-ditch effort before they entered a shelter or living in their cars. It's the last step before entering into a cycle of homelessness that they often cannot recover from. And for many, they don't really consider themselves housed, but they don't think of themselves as homeless either. After all, they have a place to go. But as you can see, This doubled up situation is often a difficult one for our families, and especially our students in transition. So homeless and doubled up. When you're making a determination, some instances when you're making a determination under McKinney-Vento are quite clear. Those who live in shelters, they're homeless. While others are going to inquire, you have to do further inquiry, and perhaps it will require you to make a judgment call. Keep in mind that you have the autonomy to do that at the LEA level in your school district as a homeless liaison. Remember, a termination of eligibility cannot delay the enrollment of these students and the prompt provision of services that they are entitled to under the McKinney-Vento Act. So ask yourself some questions. What procedures do you have in place? Do you have forms? Do you have policies and programs? Could a committee help you make decisions when it comes to these tough calls about doubled up? And do you know what resources you have in your community? And keep in mind the whole time that less than half of our youth who become homeless will actually earn a high school diploma or its equivalency. So if you have students that meet any of these criteria, you probably have homeless students in your school district. Sharing the housing of other persons implies that the child or youth is staying in someone else's residency, so you may need to use some clarifying questions to make that determination. So does the family or youth have any legal rights to be in the home? In other words, is the lease in their name, or are they subholders of a lease? Or does the family or youth have a reason to be asked at any time with no legal recourse? So if they came home tonight and they were told to leave, one of the guiding questions that we often tell our homeless liaisons to ask those students or parents is, where would you go if you couldn't go to this particular residency tonight? Do you have another place to stay, or would you be forced to live in your car? So if you lose housing, that implies that the student has no personal housing of their own or any that's available to them. And did the family or youth lose previous housing due to an eviction or foreclosure, destruction or damage to a previous residency or home? Is it unhealthy or unsafe for them to be where they're at? Did domestic violence play a reason for why they had to leave their home? Was there abuse or neglect? Was there an absence of parent or guardians due to an abandonment, a parental incarceration, or similar reasons? So as you can see, making a determination under McKinney-Vento oftentimes will require you to ask some difficult questions of your families and students. If we look at economic hardship, that implies that they have limited financial resources, and it's forced the family to leave home and leave their personal residency and then share housing due to an inability to either pay their rent or mortgage or perhaps other bills. So I think another clarifying question that you may have is, did economic hardship due to an accident or illness or loss of employment, loss of public benefits, or similar reasons force that family to then contemplate sharing the housing of others, even if it's just temporary? Doubled up homeless students are often older. We typically see them as older, but living doubled up does not have an age limit. So neither on the low end or on the high end. This may be why we see more high school students in doubled up situation, because they can become more mobile than their younger peers and younger students. Doubled up individuals often abuse substance, and less frequently than their subgroups of homeless people, but significantly more than the general population. Runaway youth, or those living in doubled up situations on their own, often find substitute caregivers. If they're resilient, then they can compensate for their lack of family support. They build relationships with mentors, teachers, and others from their schools, and these relationships oftentimes provide the encouragement and support necessary to navigate the educational process. In fact, oftentimes after they've graduated and perhaps moved on to post-secondary careers, if they're asked, what made you so much more successful than, say, a peer, oftentimes they will say that it was those mentors that they had. Keep in mind, runaways are covered under the McKinney-Vento Act. They're trying to escape different situations, and it may be something that you have to explore with that student to determine why they left home. As we've mentioned before, Robert Hallett did a study, and he did specifically his study on doubled up homeless youth. And so he said that living doubled up represented 60% of homeless youth. Congress recognized that those individuals walk a fine line between homelessness and housed. And of course, they're the least studied group of homeless adolescents, these doubled up situations are. And then, as we've mentioned before, living doubled up is often a precursor to more unstable housing. So in his book, Hallett explained that when you live doubled up, it goes against that American dream. He revealed that the tensions when families were sharing housing causes a lot of issues for our families, and he also explored how they affected the educational experiences of those students that live doubled up. Most of our doubled up situations, if you can imagine two families in a one-family home, are often chaotic and destabilizing for our students, any students of any age. But some doubled up households happily break this pattern, and Hallett did decide that he was going to study that to see why some were more successful than others. The households that were more successful exhibited cooperative strategies that often supported both the doubled up families and the good of the whole group. He described these groups as merged households and separate households. So living in homeless situations, such as living doubled up, creates risk for our students. Frequent transitioning between schools disrupts relationships formed with peers and teachers and other educational mentors. So why do children living doubled up face so much uncertainty? Well, sometimes there's new rules or perhaps no rules at all. Or perhaps it's just a new or often hectic routine because of so many people in the family and in the home. So they ask themselves, who sets the rules or boundaries in the home? Who determines the rules for the TV? Is it my mom or the other mom? And meal times, do we eat together? Do we eat separately? Do I have to cook my food? Do they have to cook their food? Shower and bath times, if they're not regimented, then maybe nobody gets shower or bath times on time. And discipline, who hands it out and then who follows through for that discipline? These are all questions that once they become unhoused and are living in doubled up situations, our students then are asking themselves. Oftentimes, we see our students who are living doubled up living in a survival mode. Their life's been put on hold. Everything stops. The differences between living in a sheltered life and living doubled up is that those students who live in shelters and transitional housing arrangements usually have outside and then access to outside supports. And those outside supports are very important for our homeless students because they may include counseling or medical and dental health care and preventative care. So those are advantages that we rarely see in our students who are living doubled up. They don't have a chance to maybe shower before school. They don't have clean clothes, or maybe they're dressing inappropriately for the seasons. And of course, there's always the secrets that families keep because they're afraid. They believe they have to lie. They believe they have to lie so that they can keep their children enrolled in their schools. They may be fleeing past landlords or bill collectors. They feel ashamed or they're afraid of losing their children. They're often embarrassed because they're afraid they'll be asked to be removed from school. They may become victims of bullying at school. They may act out because they're struggling academically or have discipline infractions because they feel so unstable. And they oftentimes hide their hungriness or their illness from adults. As you can see from this quote from Hallett's book, a young man described his residency. He says it's an apartment. We pay about $880 for rent. It's 2 bedrooms, and I live with my mom, my brother, my sister, my grandparents, my aunt, and my cousin. People in a 3-bedroom apartment, isn't it? Or a 2-bedroom apartment. He goes on to say that his aunt and cousin have their bedroom, while his mother, and brother, and sister share a room. And then they made a closet into a bedroom for him. And then the grandparents live in the living room. So while we could even consider this child doubled up, it's certainly also inadequate at the same time. Let's take a minute to talk about the merged residency. What we mean by a merged residency is that this is one of those that HALLETT described in his book. In the merged household, roles are eventually clearly defined among the two families, and accountability for following the rules is delegated, usually to one person who tends to be the decision maker, and then compromises are worked out to benefit both households. One or more of the adults may work to pay the rent or mortgage while the other adult maybe stays home and oversees childcare, transportation to school or extracurricular activities, the meal preparation and homework supervision. And in a merged household, roles are configured more like a marriage role. So these merged households tend to support youth resiliency because they're more orderly. The routine and rules are possible because someone's in charge and the other members of the household acquiesce, and then they're held accountable. Orderliness and cleanliness are more common in a merged household because there are consequences when people don't properly assume their roles. And then although the resources can be scarce in those merged households, the environment nonetheless supports students' ability to manage and direct their thinking and to control their actions and adapt to group goals. And these are basic building blocks for executive function. It's a key predictor of school success. And what HALLETT found in his study is that the separate households were not quite as successful. In separate doubled-up households, members share space, but they don't cooperate. They support more of an everyone for him or herself atmosphere, and whoever gets to the refrigerator first eats. Whoever finds a quiet place to do homework has to protect it from the noise and intrusion from other family members. If there's a shortage of bed, the last person in perhaps sleeps in the floor. So you can see that the merged household and the separate household, as you studied into his book more, really does make for two separate doubled up situations, one very much more successful than the other. So I guess what we need to learn from this presentation is when we're asking questions of our homeless families, perhaps delving into what kind of doubled up situation they're in could give you some insight into whether or not your student in your school district will be successful or be maybe more successful than others. And so from that, then you can provide support services for those particular students. So here we've provided you with some additional resources that you could have about learning more about the doubled up situations many of our families across the nation have faced. These are the references we use for this particular PowerPoint. As you can see, that third one down talks about the educational experiences of hidden homeless teenagers living doubled up. If you have a chance to research that book, it was a really great resource, and it does give you a great insight into what it means to live homeless and doubled up under McKinney-Vento. So I'd like to leave you with this last reflection. Hubert Humphrey, the moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, and those who are in the twilight of life, the aged, and those who are in the shadow of life, the seedy, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. If you have questions about the McKinney-Vento Act and the McKinney-Vento program, please feel free to contact me. My phone number and my email are on this last slide. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to the webinar, and we hope that you've gained something from it. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. Thank you.